I don't think we walk around day to day realizing just how enslaved we are by convention. The way we act, the way we communicate, the way we talk, the way we live, the way we dress, the things we think about, they're all very strictly dictated by the culture. And if you veer just slightly, just like one fraction of a millimeter off, and you are weird. There's something off about you.
Scott Dikkers has been a key visionary force in the growth, shaping, and development of the satirical publication The Onion, from a college newspaper to an iconic mainstream publication. He helped The Onion become its own original, distinctive, quirky brand of humor and satire. That required a sharp sense of contradictions, of circumstances that don't fit, of what people may be partially aware of but don't want to admit. After the satirical Onion, Scott Dikkers became an educator, writing a series of self help books about humor to promote the development of humor in others. Scott Dikkers has built a life and a career on disrupting conventional thinking and changing the perspective. So I'm going to ask, why did that happen? So, my first question, it wasn't enough for you just to be funny and satirical. Now you want to promote humor in others. This is about more than just getting laughs. It seems that you think it's important to develop the type of consciousness that is found in humor and satire, both for the health of the individual and the health of society. Is that right? And if so, why do you think the type of consciousness of humor and satire are important?
Yeah, very interesting subject. Thanks for having me here, Shawn. So I tend to look back very clearly, 2020 hindsight. And people often would ask me why I went into comedy. Why do I want to make people laugh? And I had a very clear answer because I had figured that out. I just started maybe 10 years ago. I think in glacial terms, teaching other people how to be funny, sharing the secrets I feel like I learned about how to, drum up humor out of nothing. And I don't really know yet why I'm doing that. So the reasons why I'm funny are all very personal, very emotional. You know, comedians go to therapy and they figure this stuff out, something having to do with their broken home or whatever. I've always been interested in politics and the wider world, society. I think any satirist is. A satirist basically wants to improve the world. And so they use humor to communicate to audiences. Wouldn't the world be better if we didn't do it like this? If we did it a different way? That's kind of the basic message of all satire. And so teaching people to do that is kind of feeding that part of me that wants to make the world better. Because I feel like if more people are communicating through humor, they're essentially passing on their ideas about how society can be better. And so I very much feel like a Johnny Appleseed sort of character. If I can help people learn the tools of humor quicker, because traditionally it takes people 10, 20 years to get good at humor, kind of in the school of hard knocks and just slogging it out, in comedy clubs or however people, whatever medium people are in and however they do it. And I speed up that process by giving them the tools early. So I'm opening the gates prematurely, some might say, to let these people out because we need them. We need more people to be funny. You had like a 2 or 3 part question. The last part was like, why is this important? Is that? I think it was. I think it was.
I zeroed in on the idea of the consciousness of humor and satire, not just why humor and satire are important, but why the consciousness of humor and satire are important.
I never really thought about it. For me, to define the consciousness of humor and satire would be that desire to communicate to people what's wrong with the world. And I mean, I feel like that's very important. It's, what else is there? What is more important than leaving the world better than you found it? I can't think of a single thing more important than that. Obviously taking uh, an anthrocentric view, but I'm a human being, so I'm allowed. Were you digging at something else, or is I feel like that's what you're asking?
Yeah, yeah, I am. And I'll dig into it deeper as we go along. But I want to pick up on two words you use. Use the word therapy, and you give an expression of "I don't know," and that's a really interesting thing to say. I don't know, right? Okay, so when you use the word therapy, were you also meaning that comedy and satire are therapy?
They can be for some. I was mostly talking about how when people go into the comedy business, or if they're just really funny people and that becomes a defining part of their personality, that's abnormal. Most people don't connect with other people by going into dark rooms and making large groups of them laugh. Like most people bond with others through, you know, conversate back and forth, doing good deeds, community service, raising families, whatever. You could count the number of comedians or comedy writers who have stable families on one hand. They're a very mixed up bunch. And my theory is that they just have a little bit of an abnormal, a little bit of a cockeyed way of getting the human connection, the bonding with other humans that we need. We're a very social species and we all need that. But for some reason, people who do comedy go about it a different way. And so they usually end up in therapy because they're they're off. They see other people doing things so quote unquote normally, and they wonder why they're this way, or they wonder why they can't make a relationship work, because when you're in a relationship with someone, they're not an audience. They're a fellow human, a peer that you're supposed to communicate with on a level playing field. It's not really how comedians or comedy writers work. We deal in the one speaking to the many. That's how we connect with people.
Okay, so let me ask you a question to go into the roots of comedy and satire in you. So I'm going to ask how satire and humor help you personally. And from what you've written, it seems like you've had a difficult, discordant, and adverse childhood. You describe your stepfather as a drunken, abusive Hitler figure who consciously parodied Hitler. What on earth is that? So how did you become conscious of humor and satire early in your life? Were you born with this type of consciousness? Did it develop purely in response to circumstances? Did you develop it consciously?
Well, the book that you're referencing, where I tell those stories, is The Onion Story, which also has the story of how I came by humor initially. I didn't discover satire until much later, but I came by humor as a way to communicate, as a way to bond with people because the normal pathways weren't working for me. I didn't seem to have that natural ability to make friends or, you know, uh, find a group of peers, that where I felt belonging. So making people laugh was extremely rewarding because it was the one time when I felt like, oh, I'm actually connecting with this person. They're responding to what I'm doing. And so it becomes a very one way conduit. And so, yeah, so how I came by satire, like I said, much later, I discovered Mad Magazine, which by the time I had discovered it, it was mostly doing kids' humor. There wasn't a whole lot of satire, there was a lot of parody. And then I discovered Monty Python in high school. They were definitely doing satire, like social satire, political satire. But I didn't really understand it. I just knew it was great. And so I started doing my comic strip and I started doing other types of humor and I started doing The Onion. And we got this gang of other writers together. And it wasn't until maybe 3, 4, 5 years into it that we discovered that satire was the funniest type of comedy. When the comedy is just juvenile and fun and goofy, we're all having a good laugh, but there's something more richly satisfying about humor that tears down some cherished, established societal dogma or person or rules, something about the way human beings are, something fundamental. If you can go at that and pick that apart and say, hey, there's something wrong with this, we should do things differently. You can layer all that other kind of humor on top of that, the juvenile stuff, the goofy stuff, to create this wonderful layer cake of comedy. And one of the tools I learned about comedy is oftentimes what makes people laugh is the layers because it's almost like too much stimuli to process at one time, which makes you laugh. It's just like the same thing as crying. Too much emotional stimuli will make you cry. Too much intellectual, incongruent, or silly stimuli will make you laugh.
Scott, not everybody who reads Mad Magazine becomes a Scott Dikkers. Okay,
That is true.
you know, some people it does nothing for them. It does nothing. So what I'm really asking is was there something in you before you read Mad Magazine that um, uh, unleashed the potential for satire that you already had? So for example, um, a young child may not be aware of a definition of satire, but might parody and mock others,
Mm-hmm.
And I would wonder whether, say, a child at an early age who is parodying and mocking others is, in a sense, already developing that consciousness for satire before it becomes more conscious and formalized by Mad Magazine.
Yeah,
Do you think? Yeah.
before it becomes more refined. Yeah, and that was part of my humor. I was throwing everything at the wall, hoping stuff would stick because I kind of had my way of being in the world, and that was to be funny. And so, yeah, I made fun of people. I made fun of celebrities, politicians, people in my orbit, family, school, etc. And that probably is the precursor to satire, because you've got a target, and comedy usually is, you're usually laughing at something. There is some target involved, and how sophisticated, or how precision that targeting is one of the main things I think distinguishes satire from any other type of humor.
So, are you aware that, say, as a child, you were parodying and mocking others and had that capacity?
Oh yeah, I was aware that I was doing that. Yeah.
Yeah. Your Hitler-esque stepdad was, in a sense, a bad satirist. That is,
Yeah.
but in a sense, he was doing a parody, but not with the type of consciousness we'd want you to do a parody of
Yeah, he
Hitler.
was doing like an impression, which is, I think of it as a subset of parody. And I was doing impressions too. Like I loved trying to mimic other people's voices, and it's a great humor trick, a little stunt that big crowd pleaser. So
So, are you agreeing that there was something in your character, something in your consciousness, um, that was satirical before you became aware of satire?
yeah, I don't know. The introspection necessary for that might be too deep even for me. And I'm a pretty introspective person, but chicken or egg, like I'm a blank slate when I'm born, and I'm a product of my conditions. Would anyone in similar conditions have done the same thing? Maybe. Whether it was something inherent in me, I don't know, because I can't really go back and diagnose that far.
Fair enough. I'm not even sure these questions can be answered.
Well,
You know,
it's fun to
Maybe they
try.
can. I mean, this, like you say, it's the old chicken and the egg uh, dilemma, and it may be something that we can't solve.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. Satire is like a corrosive that burns away conventional and generic thinking to get beyond them. So, what do you discover lies in that's beyond conventionality? What is that undiscovered country beyond conventionality?
Oh yeah, that is the great frontier, greater than the West, greater than outer space, greater than the deep sea. Because I don't think we walk around day to day realizing just how enslaved we are by convention. The way we act, the way we communicate, the way we talk, the way we live, the way we dress, the things we think about, they're all very strictly dictated by the culture. And if you veer just slightly, just like one fraction of a millimeter off, and you are weird. There's something off about you. It's like if I did this whole interview like this, um, you would think, what's up with this guy? Why is he so weird? I'm just holding my hand up here. It's just a slight shift, like in the row of infinite parallel universes. This one is right next to ours. The only difference is my hand is up here instead of like this. And suddenly I'm a weirdo, and it's like something's wrong with that guy. Like, don't have him on your podcast. He's just weird. So there's a whole universe of different behaviors and different ways of being and different ways of thinking that I've always been fascinated by. And I've been fascinated by how people react when you do things differently. I told the story in that book you mentioned of how I crawled to school one day. So I did that with a buddy of mine, Troy Whipple. We saw this guy on one of these TV shows like Real People or That's Incredible or something. He crawled, he broke the world record for crawling, and he crawled like 32 miles or something. And we thought, how hard is that? Like we could break that record. So, and he had all these accoutrements. He tore car tires and put them under his arms so he wouldn't damage his arms while he was crawling and stuff, or his hands, I guess, and his knees. And so we hatched this plan to crawl to school. And again, just a tiny shift from walking to school, barely noticeable. Like if you were an alien coming from outer space, you'd say it's the same thing. They're getting to school. What's the big deal? But it was a scandal. It was, I'm still remembered to this day in that town, the small town that I went to high school in, as the kid who crawled to school. And that was fascinating to me how you could just tweak convention, an infinitesimal amount, and you could get that kind of reaction. Pretty amazing. Pretty amazing. We are absolutely enslaved in every way. And you can see it just if you go to a different culture. If you go to Japan or Saudi Arabia or Israel, you name it, they're going to have different ways of talking and being, and you're going to do something like, oh, that's a faux pas. You don't do that here, or whatever, And these are all, uh, you know, we're pretty interrelated at this point. Almost a worldwide culture, but we still have these little derivations that can cause real problems. And and time too. Like you go back and you look how life was in the 50s, and how people felt about, I don't know, so many things like marriage, sexuality, that kind of stuff, the way they dressed, the way they talked. Golly gee whiz, Shawn, I wish I could answer that question. Just like little things like that would have sounded normal then, but now it's like, what's off? This guy's weird. So I'm fascinated by that. I think about it all the time, and I don't feel bound by the convention, although I totally am. I'm just as enslaved as everybody else, but I like to think I'm not, and so I'm always attracted to people who are weird, people who march to the beat of their own drum, people who act weirdly or differently. I'm delighted by that. I think it's the spice of life. My brother Alan is probably my best example, and he's been that way his whole life. He and I sort of adopted this from him, this idea that if everyone else is doing it, there must be something wrong with it. And so he would just do things differently. And he decided that he was going to live outside and and make his own clothes. Like he was tired of buying clothes. He was tired of living in houses, apartments. And so he lived in a horse barn one winter in Wisconsin, and he made all his own clothes from roadkill. He would scoop up like skunks and other animal carcasses off the road, and he would tan the hides and he would sew them into clothing, and that's what he wore. And so that's an inspiration to me. Somebody who could be that. And again, it's a small shift from the normal. It's how people used to live, and not roadkill, but they made their own clothes. They lived outside, no big deal. But now you do that, and you're call the people in the white jackets. So he's one example. There are a lot of people who I hired at the Onion as writers who came in and were just a little off, a little weird. Um, Todd Hansen, who's our head writer for many years, was one of these people who felt like he just marched to the beat of his own drum. He everything there was something wrong with everything, and that's how he saw the world. Like, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with me? What's wrong with you? And that is such a rich reservoir of satirical thought. And he's come up with probably more headlines and more brilliant classic Onion stories than anybody, not surprisingly. And the trickster and the satirist, that's their archetype. They are a trickster often. tricking people into thinking that they're partaking of serious opinion when really it's satirical. You know, Mark Twain did that. He's a big believer in that, the satirist as trickster. And when we communicate to audiences the foibles of other human beings, we use archetypes that they love and have seen come back again and again and again